Okay, I think we can get started. We have an exciting webinar for you today. Thank you everyone for joining. We have John Kagia, Chief Knowledge Officer of New Frontier Data, Michael Harlow, Partner at CohnReznick, and Bob Hoban, President and CEO of the Hoban Law Group. Just to let you know, if you have questions, we are going to take all questions at the end. So you can write them down in the little QA button at the bottom. I will be monitoring, and then at the end we will get to all questions. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to the team. Take it away.
Thank you very much for that, Craig. We're delighted to be here having this conversation about what we think are going to be some of the most consequential trends facing the cannabis industry, facing the legal cannabis industry in 2019. And we think three areas that are particular important will be the trend toward professionalization of the industry. And you see that with the number of seasoned experts, seasoned professionals coming in from other sectors into cannabis, an accelerating trend. We see that with consolidation in this industry, where we're seeing an intense amount of merger and acquisition activity as operators seek to build capacity and scale. And then we're seeing we will be seeing a lot of reorganization this year as cannabis businesses begin to transition from what has been a fairly informal, casually operated environment into one which they are reflecting the expectations of every other sector of the economy. And so in that context, we'll quickly introduce New Frontier for those of you who might not know us. Spend some time walking through the key trends transforming the cannabis industry's dynamics, and then close with some key takeaways, at which point we will hand off to our two other speakers, Michael Harlow, Partner at CohnReznick, and Bob Hoban, CEO of Hoban Law Group, amongst many other entities, to share their respective perspectives on the evolving dynamics of 2019. So just very quickly about New Frontier, for those of you who might not know us. New Frontier is a data analytics firm that is focused exclusively on the legal cannabis industry. We offer better data, actionable business intelligence, and risk management solutions for stakeholders across this space. A couple of important points about New Frontier. One is that we are a DC-based, we're headquartered in Washington, DC, but we have a global footprint and a global reach. Indeed, next week we're working with a team of partners to organize one of our first major international events, a conference in Panama, reflecting the expanse of our international efforts. And then second is that New Frontier is a issue-neutral organization. We are not involved in advocacy. We do not take a position for or against cannabis, but rather we view our mission and mandate as providing objective, rigorously analyzed, and deeply insightful perspectives on this very quickly evolving market. As a data company, and we'll touch on the various data sets that we have used to demonstrate these dynamics, but we draw our data from 5 sources primarily. We get a lot of data from the federal government, which helps us better understand broad national trends that are shaping this industry. We pull a lot of data from state and local governments, which enable us to understand how the market regulations in each of these states and each of these jurisdictions is impacting the performance of the markets at the state and local level. We have a lot of industry partners who provide us data, whether it's producers, processors, or retailers, that enable us to understand this very quickly evolving supply chain and better understand the business of cannabis. We get data from ancillary sectors. So these are all of the sectors that support the plant-touching side of the industry, include everything from financial and accounting services, legal services, to nutrient manufacturers and soil growers or soil producers, all being critical to understanding the totality of the factors shaping this industry. And finally, we get a lot of data from cannabis consumers. who we think have been a long neglected part of this conversation, but are playing an increasingly consequential role in the evolution of this industry. So what are the key trends transforming the cannabis industry's dynamics? The first is that cannabis is going global. The fact that when we began focusing specifically on the legal cannabis industry nearly 5 years ago now, broadly speaking, there were only a handful of countries around the world where there was cannabis dynamics of consequence or worth noting. But now that we have such a dramatic expansion of access to both legal cannabis, decriminalized markets, medical cannabis, or hemp, there is truly a global conversation that is taking place right now. And I'm not sure if you had seen, but just last week there was a report suggesting that the WHO is about to make a recommendation, the World Health Organization is about to make a recommendation for the descheduling of cannabis, which will have extraordinary implications for the global cannabis conversation as countries now wrestle with the tension between prohibition-based policies and the world's leading health organization suggesting that cannabis can and should be regulated in a less punitive way. And the expanse of this global opportunity is best understood if you understand just how many cannabis consumers there are globally. So based on New Frontier's fresh off the presses analysis, we estimate that there are 272 million cannabis consumers globally, which is about just 6% of the world's population aged 15 and over. The prevalence of cannabis use does vary regionally, but it is notable that, for example, that while North America leads, and that's certainly understandable given how well established consumption has been in those markets, a region like Africa, where you have nearly 11.5% of people aged 15 plus reporting they used cannabis in the past year, it's a high use region relative to the rest of the globe, but has been relatively neglected in this global conversation. So the point here is that there's a very large global cannabis consumer market right now. The size of this market is part of the reason why this global conversation is accelerating as quickly as it is. And North America is at the vanguard and leading this global movement. So taking that a step further, looking specifically at just the US, on the last slide, we saw that in the global average rate of past year use is just around 6.5%. Here in the US, when we look at just past month use, it has grown really significantly over the past decade. We're now at 10% of American adults say they consume cannabis regularly, equivalent to 24.5 million Americans. And what's striking about that is that that number has grown by nearly 10 million Americans since 2009. Why is this important? It means that not only is the base, the base of cannabis consumers growing quickly, but it also means that we're seeing much more diverse, much more sophisticated consumers in this market. And because of that, it is imperative that businesses operating in this space approach the consumer with a more nuanced, a more sophisticated understanding of who they are and what's animating their behavior. So all these cannabis consumers in the US are driving a very substantial market. So again, this is fresh off the presses New Frontier modeling. Our newly updated US forecast for 2019 through 2022 shows that the combined legal, medical, adult use, and illicit market will grow from about $40 billion to nearly $49 billion by 2022. Of that, adult use sales, recreational sales, will grow most quickly from just under $6 billion to $10 billion over the next 4 years. And that's just in the states where cannabis is currently legal. So this model does not include the likely legalization that we will be seeing in places like New York and New Jersey on the adult use side. We just saw yesterday that a bill was introduced in Pennsylvania for adult use legalization there as well. So the total potential opportunity, particularly in the legal med and legal recreational markets, is substantially larger than this as we start seeing more states pass legalization measures, one, and two, as we see this national conversation, the efforts to pass some sort of national law gain momentum. It's an open question whether anything substantial will get through Congress, the US Congress, in 2019, given our current political dynamic. But certainly, if and when we see a national bill passed, we think that would be catalytic to the scale of opportunity that we see in the US. So in recognition of the market opportunity presented by legalization in an environment with a large number of cannabis consumers, we have seen the pace of investment into the cannabis industry grow dramatically. And so this slide shows that between 2015, where we saw just under $1 billion in investment into the entire cannabis space, that number grew to nearly $14 billion in 2018. But there's two important aspects to that. One is that of that nearly $14 billion, nearly half of it came from just two companies. Big Alcohol, Constellation Brands, one of the world's leading alcohol companies, which made a very substantial investment, a $4 billion investment into canopy growth, one of Canada's largest producers. And then Altria, the parent company of Philip Morris, Marlboro, making a $1.8 billion investment into Kronos Group, again, another Canadian licensed producer. Why is this important? As you start to see consumer packaged goods companies, big alcohol, tobacco, the Coca-Colas and Pepsis of the world, start to enter this space, the ability for these companies to make market-moving investments will be a major source for capital infusions for the companies that they invest in. And the companies that they invest in will be then very strategically positioned to make acquisitions, to build and grow market share, to establish production capacity in a way that smaller, less well-capitalized companies will be able to. And so as you think about where this space is going and where your respective companies might sit in this market, understanding the market moving potential of the entrance of these large consumer packaged good companies gives us an indication of why we are seeing both consolidation and the need for professionalization, given the sophistication of these new market entrants. A parallel dynamic to the very large investment into the space being made by traditional investors increasingly and by the consumer packaged goods is, in the US, the rise of the multi-state operators. Now, multi-state operators are companies that have licenses across multiple markets, and broadly speaking, generally also have multiple types of licenses. So these are companies that have production, processing, and retail licenses. We've selected 5 companies here, 5 publicly traded MSOs to show how this trend is evolving. But amongst the largest ones, like Acreage, who are already in 19 markets, you can see that these companies are laying the foundation or are approaching this market with the intent and expectation that cannabis will be legal nationally, and they will have a framework that enables them to become the first true national cannabis brands. Just worth noting that across these 5 companies, the average 61 dispensary licenses amongst them, and a market cap of just over $1.5 billion. So you can see that they have very large operations, and they have very, very large market caps based on the expectation that they're very well positioned to grow. Another angle on the consolidation piece, because we think this is quite important. In California, where there are no limits on the number of cultivation licenses you can get, we've been monitoring the issuance of active cultivation licenses to understand how many companies are capturing the most number of cultivation licenses. And it's worth noting that even though there are nearly 3,000 companies that have been issued cultivation licenses in the state, 15 have received nearly a fifth of the licenses issued. 30 have just, or 45 have about a third of the licenses issued, of the 6,500 licenses issued. Why is this important? Well, we know that in about 3 years, California is going to open up the limits on the size of cultivation facilities to allow cultivation facilities of unlimited size. Well, for the companies that have secured these multiple cultivation licenses, which are often geographically proximate to each other, their ability to then establish these very large operations it gives them a lot of agility in order to establish these large-scale operations. And so we anticipate that as California continues to mature and as the cultivation environment becomes more competitive, these larger scale, particularly the large scale, very efficient growers will be well established, will be well positioned to dominate the production environment in the coming years. There's a dynamic related to this consolidation and drive to scale that we've talked about quite a bit, but we continue to stress. Using the average market rate for a pound of cannabis in Colorado, we think we have a perfect illustration of how quickly the economics of cannabis are evolving. So in January 2015, the average price for a pound of cannabis was over $2,000 in Colorado. In the January 2019 advisory, that had fallen to $781. So you've seen a 61% decline in average market rate for flower in this market, and for growers and broadly speaking for everyone in the supply chain, this should be a powerful lesson that you should plan for where the industry is going, not where it currently is. As the market becomes more competitive, focusing on operational efficiency, getting production costs as low as possible is going to be critical to remaining viable, remaining competitive as this market matures. Well, we couldn't go through this conversation without talking about the emerging hemp sector. Late last year in December, we saw the passage of the Farm Bill, which included a significant expansion of legal hemp in the US. We think this is going to catalyze dramatic growth in the hemp sector in the US, which will begin by significant investments in production, in cultivation, in processing, and in distribution. So our current estimate for a $2.5 billion hemp-based US market is actually quite conservative. And we will continue to update and refine this based on how quickly many of these state markets get operational and how quickly we can get some of this processing capacity established. But the point here is that hemp creates a parallel opportunity to what we've been seeing on the marijuana side of the ledger. And some of the capacity and scale that we anticipate being built for the hemp side of the ledger will have implications and applications for the marijuana side of the ledger. Indeed, it is part of the reason why we're seeing so much interest now amongst the Canadian licensed producers in the US hemp market. we expect it to be a sector that grows very, very aggressively in the coming months. Just a quick final point, which is that as the consumer environment has evolved, we have seen consumer preference for products evolve very drastically. With the share of flour has fallen quite dramatically just since 2015 nationally. This is data that, based on MJ Freeway's, the leading point of sale platform in the industry, covers about half the dispensaries in the market. And across all of the dispensaries that they serve, we've seen the share of flour fall by 39% in the past few years. We've seen concentrates in particular grow 144%. Why this is important is, again, it speaks to the very quickly evolving dynamics of the space and the imperative to know who your customer is, what products they're buying, and why they're consuming those products. Failure to effectively understand the evolving market for consumer behavior, we think will be critical or the companies that best understand this evolving consumer dynamic, we think will be best positioned for market growth. As some of you might have seen, New Frontier's 2018 Cannabis Consumer Survey explored in quite robust detail the evolving cannabis consumer. And I won't go into detail on the 9 archetypes that we identified, which range from the traditional lifestylers down through the sober dabblers and infrequent conservatives. But we believe that this is a truly revolutionary approach to cannabis consumer segmentation. And to us, it is a reflection of the elevated levels of sophistication that will be needed to engage with the cannabis consumer of tomorrow. So a final point about the evolving dynamics within this sector. We think technology is going to have a massively disruptive effect on virtually every aspect of this industry, from cultivation, where you're seeing a lot of new technology integration into cultivation facilities, whether it's in automated light systems to fully automated harvesting approaches. But whether it's cultivation, processing, business operations, so the seed to sale, the inventory management, the supply chain and distribution management, genomics and cannabis genetics, where you have companies like Phylos enabling consumers and producers to better understand what products, how different genetics will express in the consumer experience. When we talk about engaging the consumer through marketing and communications, whether that's through these social media platforms that are gaining traction from a cannabis-specific vantage point, and even in product delivery, the fact that you have technology playing such a key role in innovating the way cannabis delivery mechanisms are deployed, suggests that the companies that embrace the role of technology in advancing the business operations will be best positioning themselves to compete in a maturing and increasingly competitive market. So just a few key takeaways, and we'll make these slides available post hoc. But the gist of this is that the cannabis industry is evolving very quickly, and it's going to be critical to for stakeholders in this space to focus on operational efficiency, on cost containment, and on understanding where the most lucrative emerging opportunities are. 2, the cratering prices that we're seeing on the wholesale side are just part of a broader trend where we are seeing the economics of cannabis being dramatically destabilized. And so in that context, every stakeholder in this industry has to plan for and build their companies based on where the industry is going, not where it is today. And then maybe a third and final point I would make is that the cannabis consumer is not a monolith. We have to get away from thinking about the cannabis consumer as either just medical or recreational, and really deploy the marketing sophistication of the broader consumer packaged good environment to ensure that the excellence through which marketing has evolved in the CPG space is being reflected in the emerging cannabis global market. And then a final point, which is that as the cannabis industry evolves globally, think globally, act locally. Understand that this opportunity is moving very, very quickly. I know Bob is going to speak to this. But even as the opportunities emerge globally, tailor your implementations to reflect the local business and local cultural dynamics. Thank you very much. So with that, I'll hand it off to Michael Harlow, partner at CohnReznick, to walk us through the accounting and tax considerations for the 2019 and beyond.
Thank you, John, for that update on the state of the industry. I really want to kind of set the table here, talk about what we've seen through 2018 and what our expectations are for 2019. Now, we've seen a rash of consolidation across the industry during the second half of 2018 and only expect that trend to continue through 2019. Everything I'm talking about is coming directly from conversations we've had with either existing clients or prospects that are pursuing deals in the industry and the issues and frustrations that they've had. And we see that the average cannabis investor will continue to get larger and more sophisticated as that are entering the space. We believe that existing operators are going to need to adapt to this more sophisticated environment and basically step up their game. The sloppy business practices that were the norm 2 or 3 years ago are now negatively impacting business valuations and in some cases killing deals. We've worked on several transactions over the past years that were very successful consolidations, but we've also seen several that have blown up or fallen apart. And we want to talk about what some of those problems are, roadblocks that can be avoided. So to recap the 2018 trends, as John mentioned, there's been a dramatic growth in multi-state operators. There's been a big evolution in cannabis investor. We're seeing larger and larger family offices, private equity funds. Of course, the Canadian public market has been very hot over the last year. And maybe most interesting is the evolution of the corporate investor, being Constellation and Altria are the two big ones that come to mind. We also continue to see significant price compression, as John mentioned, in the mature markets in Oregon, Washington State, and Colorado, to name the big three. So 3 or 4 years ago in those markets where there was a rush to gain as much market domination or market share as possible, now we see a rush to gain more and more efficiency. You can't take for granted that you're going to have $200 a pound for the foreseeable future. If you're really operating in a $700 a pound environment, how do you gain operational and business efficiencies to be able to be successful in that market? So what we're seeing in the newer East Coast markets, we've already seen play out in the West Coast markets. So it shouldn't be a big surprise what's going to come in those East Coast markets. We also had the Farm Bill pass late in 2018, which Bob is going to talk about in more detail later. We saw a dramatic increase, I would say, in the last 2 or 3 months in 2018 with a number of potential clients calling us for questions and help specific to accounting and tax issues to help. That really took off, and we believe that's going to continue, fueled mainly by the passage of the Farm Bill. As John mentioned, there's a continuation of what we would call the professionalization of the industry. 2 or 3 years ago, when we as accountants were going to trade shows wearing slacks and blazers, we definitely kind of stuck out. We notice now that as we go into the same events for the second or third year in a row, we don't stick out as much as we used to. So that is changing the face of the industry in some respects. I'm not necessarily commenting on whether that's a positive or a negative, but it is happening. Being a native North Carolinian, I also thought that it was very interesting that the last couple shows that I went to in 2018, I consistently ran into people who had spent time in my hometown of Greensboro, North Carolina, or our next door neighbor, Winston-Salem, who all had experience in big tobacco. So we didn't necessarily run into representatives of big tobacco at trade shows, but we did run into new management staff, new marketing staff, new business staff in cannabis companies that had all come out of long, and successful careers in tobacco. So I've found that really fascinating to walk around trade shows towards the end of 2018 and consistently run into people that had North Carolina accents. That's also had an impact on the deals we've seen. Beginning in 2018, we would have clients come to us pursuing roll-ups or combinations across state lines for multi-state operators, and their primary focus was on the tax structuring and the tax planning. How do we take these disparate corporate entities and roll them all up into one consolidated entity? I noticed that towards the fourth quarter of 2018, one of the new requests that we got on almost every one of those assignments was to help the client structure a management incentive plan as part of that roll-up. They're looking for new management that is being recruited out of other industries are looking for the same benefits they had in those other industries: healthcare, 401ks, retirement plans, stock options, warrants, some kind of incentive stock plan or incentive management plan. So we've seen for the first time in the fourth quarter of 2018, clients really taking heed and putting together executive compensation plans that are competitive with other existing industries. So going into 2019, we expect all of these trends to continue. We expect to see more roll-ups of operators across state lines. As John mentioned, even in Pennsylvania, we're starting to see talk about adult use or rec markets. Massachusetts, New York, and New Jersey, we get lots of inbound prospective client calls on a weekly basis, so we believe those states are very hot. We also believe there's potential for congressional action. Last Tuesday, I was fortunate enough to be at the New Frontier Policy Summit at the National Press Club here in downtown DC. Both of the congressmen present predicted passage of either the States Act or something akin to the States Act by the end of 2019. I think that might be an ambitious goal, but to have leading congressional representatives making those statements is not something that we were hearing the first half of 2018. So that's very interesting. And it also has an impact on some of the tax structuring we're doing. We still want to structure transactions that are 280 efficient as 280E efficient as possible, but we also want to plan for the future when 280E may not be around. So we do not want to create tax or business structures that are 280E favorable, but are so complicated that they would be unworkable or lose their benefit once 280E goes away. So we're having those types of conversations with clients now that we may not have had 9 months or a year ago. We're also seeing a significant increase in the amount of inbound calls we're getting from foreign investors who are asking for help structuring foreign investment in U.S. cannabis operations. At the same time, we're seeing existing U.S. clients calling with questions about how to structure, from a tax perspective, investments in overseas operators. Now, Bob can talk a little bit later about some of the complications related to foreign investment in U.S. markets, because it's not for the faint of heart, and there are lots of legal and tax issues that you have to be concerned about. but it's notable that we are getting unsolicited phone calls from foreign investors asking for tax help now that we weren't necessarily getting at the beginning of 2018. Okay, so let's talk about 280E just a little bit. This is not a 280E presentation, but for whatever reason, I can't seem to get through a cannabis tax presentation without talking about 280E. So I'm going to frame it in the sense that we're going to talk about 280E, but how failure to comply and be cognizant of 280E is going to hurt your long-term valuation and may damage your ability to participate in some kind of future consolidation or roll-up. So for those of you that have been under a rock for the past 2.5 or 3 years, 280E is the IRS code section that precludes cannabis operators from deducting anything other than cost of goods sold. It goes back to a court case in 1982 in which a drug trafficker was convicted but was able to keep the financial windfall or the benefits of his illicit activity. Congress, in their wisdom, didn't think that was very fair, so they passed 280E into the tax code, which said that anyone trafficking a Schedule I narcotic cannot deduct anything on any of the ordinary and normal business expenses in calculating taxable income. This means that the only deduction you're allowed to take is your cost of goods sold. So we see dispensary retail operations and distribution companies paying effectively a 60 or 70% tax rate. And if we go on to the next slide, this is a calculation or a presentation that I first used at last Tuesday's event. And even though this is not a 280 focused discussion, they received very favorable comments last week, so I wanted to share it again. This is an illustration. I've made some very basic assumptions, but as long as you keep all of the assumptions the same across the 3 different categories, you're still going to come up with the same result. And the result being that your 280E limited business is paying significantly more in taxes than either a non-280E limited business or someone operating the black market. So think of your first column, the 280E limited business, as a licensed, regulated retail dispensary in a legal rec state. Okay, your non-280E limited business could basically be any other retail establishment, liquor store, coffee shop, whatever it might be. That is a regular C Corp filing taxpayer. Black market is assuming all the same business fundamentals as the 280E limited business, but just operating the black market, so they're paying no income tax. Now, of course, those assumptions aren't very accurate, because we all know that black market operator is not paying local business tax. They're not paying to have their product tested. They're not paying a premium on the rent that a licensed business would pay. So in reality, that additional post-tax cash flow for the black market operator is probably much greater than the $300,000 I'm showing there. But I wanted to keep all of the costs the same just for illustrative purposes. Okay, so if your total sales are $2 million, cost of goods sold is $1 million, which is pretty typical, 100% markup. That leaves you with a gross margin of $1 million. So your 280E limited business is paying tax on that gross margin, okay? Then you have your general administrative costs, everything other than your cost of goods sold. Your labor for your bud tenders, your rent for the store, insurance, electricity, utilities, everything else that it takes to run your business. So taxable income for the 280E limited business is $1 million. Taxable income for the non-280E limited business is $300,000. Okay, they both have the same pre-tax cash flow of $300,000. That doesn't change. It's just what the tax is calculated on. So the federal corporate tax for the 280E limited business is $210,000. as opposed to only 63 for the non-280E limited business. And that's assuming these are both structured as C corporations paying the 21% new C Corp tax rate. So that means the effective tax rate as compared to the pre-tax cash flow is 70% for the 280E business and 21%, which is the corporate rate, for the non-280E limited business. In other words, the dispensary owner gets to take home $90,000. The coffee shop owner gets to take home $237,000. And the black market operator gets to pocket something north of $300,000. So this is important to understand from a policy perspective, because it definitely makes the economics of that licensed business much less desirable. Okay, so now let's talk about what your different types of operators or license holders. 280E has a different impact as you go down the integration model at the top with our cultivators and producers. 80-90% of what you're doing is going to be cost of goods sold anyway, just by definition. That's what you're in the business to do, is to produce goods. For a vertically integrated operator that beginning to end, cultivation, processing, retail, while 280E is a problem at their retail level, it's mitigated by the fact that they're going to have a blended tax rate throughout the structure. You have a big problem at the retail and dispensary level. In most states, you're doing very little to the product once you purchase it. Some states may allow you to repackage. Other states, you're doing nothing other than unpackaging and putting on the shelf. So that means there's very little opportunity to add anything or argue that there's anything being added to cost of goods sold for the dispensary at the retail level. And then at the worst case scenario, your distribution license holder, who is just picking up product from one location and delivering it to another, there's no opportunity to add anything to cost of goods sold. Your big spend in that distribution model are your drivers and everything. So you're really getting crunched. So even though 280E is this big problem that we've talked about, we're really concerned that clients are motivated. If we go back to the last slide, clients are motivated by these numbers. And when they get overly ambitious about trying to be aggressive or sloppy in their 280E compliance, while they might save some money here, they're really hurting their future business value, because we've seen multiple deals where we get into the due diligence process and we get down to reviewing the tax returns for the acquired entity and find that there's no 280E exclusion. There's no basis for what they've done in the returns. And we have a giant unknown federal tax liability. This isn't even talking about the states. I mean, you take these same issues and layer on the state rates and it just gets bigger. So congratulations, you might have saved some dollars on your annual tax filings, but now you've created a giant unknown tax liability. And there's a good chance, if a buyer is trying to decide between making two different acquisitions, one of them is 280E compliant and one of them is not, I can guarantee you they're going to put their money into the compliant operation. All right, so transitioning real quick before we turn it over to Bob, we talked about the new, and we'll just go ahead and skip over some of the 280E stuff. Another due diligence hiccup that we've seen that have sunk deals. It's a perverse relationship that you can't get access to real banking, which forces you to be a cash basis business, which forces you to file a Form 8300 every time you receive a cash transaction greater than $10,000 within 15 days of the receipt of cash. So on one hand, the federal government's making it very difficult for you to be banked. Therefore, you have to use cash. But if you use cash, you have to file 8300 every time you have a transaction greater than $10,000. It sounds like a relatively minor issue, but this compliance issue has hung up a lot of operators, and again, has come up in the due diligence process. So you need to be prepared that if you're going to market yourself for acquisition, You need to be able to support your 280E position. You need to be able to show that you're filing your 8300s, and you need to be able to show that you are current on all state and local sales, use, property tax filings. We have seen a lot of deals get either slowed down or had additional proceeds be put into escrow because of these tax issues. Okay, so we've got plenty of other items that we can talk about that we've seen that have hung up due diligence on deals, but let's go ahead and move over to Bob because I think that he's going to cover some of the same issues, and then we can come back to these points through the question and answer session if time allows.
Michael, thank you very much, and I'm proud to be here with my colleagues Michael and John on this panel. This is very good information, and it's high-level information. I want to reiterate a couple of things that were said already. What John said about the globalization of the cannabis industry. Make no mistake, if you're not examining this industry from a global perspective, then you're not really examining the issue thoroughly, because it's a point where the industry is small enough, even though it is global, to get your arms around the reputable players and participants in the industry, and to understand and make relationships with a number of international governments to go facilitate business in those jurisdictions. So please do not view the industry as some sort of nascent industry that's in the US, whether it's marijuana or hemp, but rather look at it as a global supply chain and see where you fit in that supply chain, because that's the reality of the situation. I'd also like to reiterate what Michael said about the professionalism coming into the industry. Professionalism is something that the industry has been begging for, and professionals are coming to the industry. Not to say that the folks initially in this industry were not professionals or are not professionals, but it's really the professionalism coupled with the experience that comes from other fields, other industries that bear tremendous influence on how this industry is developing, whether that is, as Michael said, tobacco, or the beverage industry, the alcohol industry, the food industry, the supplement industry. These are all places where professionals are coming from. Brands and distribution channels like Procter & Gamble and Diageo Foods and Hershey's, and to a much smaller extent than you'd think, the pharmaceutical industry. So now is the time to really take a deeper look at this and a deeper dive. And Spencer, if you could flip to the next slide as a guideline. I'd like to talk about 280E for just 5 seconds. 280E should not, I stress, should not apply when you're talking about industrial hemp, particularly in light of the recent passage of the Farm Bill, and I'll talk about that here in just a moment. But the recent Farm Bill, the new Farm Bill, the 2018 Farm Bill, if you will, makes it eminently clear that industrial hemp within the confines prescribed therein, in other words, the states have to enact certain programs, and that industrial hemp has to be cultivated in conjunction with that program. But that industrial hemp is clearly accepted, carved out specifically from the Controlled Substances Act. What's interesting about the new Farm Bill is that when McConnell's office talked to us about assisting them in drafting this measure, they said they wanted to cut and sever all ties between the DEA and any potential claim of jurisdiction over industrial hemp. So in doing that analysis, we looked very deeply at the Controlled Substances Act. And the only two mentions of cannabis within the CSA, the Controlled Substances Act, since the 70s, are the definition of marijuana and the definition of THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, which is the psychoactive ingredient within cannabis plants. So the way that we've advised them and the way that they took the advice and drafted the proposal for the existing Farm Bill, which was, of course, signed by the President on December 21st, severs those ties unequivocally. In other words, the definition of marijuana describes what cannabis is, and then it defines marijuana, and then it describes the exempted parts of the plant, which, interestingly enough, were previously, many years ago, into the 40s, the parts of the plant that they defined as hemp, basically, the stalks, the fiber, because those were the technologically advanced uses of the plant at that point in time, and we've transcended that dramatically. So, but that definition of marijuana, basically, take the period at the end of the sentence and put a comma in there and say, and this shall not cover anything that comes from an industrial hemp plant as defined as follows. That's a paraphrase. That's not exactly what it says, but my point is they took the existing definition and then they put a clause in there that says, except as defined as industrial hemp. So it carved out industrial hemp altogether from the CSA, so 280A should not apply. The other place where it was severed completely, and this is a surprise, this is something that a lot of people aren't aware of and frankly don't know how to handle this. Why is marijuana a controlled substance? It's a controlled substance because of the psychoactive ingredient. There's more to the story, of course, social reasons, financial reasons from that point in time. But the primary reason it ends up in the CSA is because of the psychoactive component, tetrahydrocannabinol. So when they define THC in the Controlled Substances Act, the same analysis to sever the DEA's jurisdiction over industrial hemp was performed, and that's what made it into federal law as signed by the president. What it says is tetrahydrocannabinol, and it defines what that is. And again, at the end of that sentence, it says period. Change that period to a comma, except as found within industrial hemp. So what that just did is that answered all the activists in the movement, the people that involved in the cannabis reformation movement, which is, I don't think any of us on this call, it's the activists that have been working for decades and decades and decades to legalize the plant. Well, they just got what they wanted, and I don't hear enough people talking about it. THC that comes from industrial hemp is not a controlled substance any longer. So what does that mean? Does that mean you can go make THC products in your garage? Of course not. Does that mean you could put THC products into the stream of commerce right now? I wouldn't recommend that. But what it does mean is that the FDA is faced with a significant challenge regarding cannabinoids, THC being one of them, and how it's going to regulate those cannabinoids. We comment on that for a moment. The THC that comes out of a plant, the plant matter by dry weight must be 0.3% or below. But if you have 50 acres, let alone 500 acres or 5,000 acres of industrial hemp, it creates commercially appreciable amounts of THC. And if that THC is no longer a controlled substance governed by the DEA, how will the FDA handle it? Well, we know a little bit of insight because we talk to the FDA rather at least twice a week. We created the environmentally the environment within which CBD is treated like a food or a supplement. The only state in the country, Colorado, that allows hemp-derived derivatives for human consumption to be produced and regulated is the state of Colorado, because we were able to enact a policy 2 years ago and pass that legislation last year. Now, this will all change when the FDA steps up and asserts its control over this new pathway, quote unquote, over industrial hemp derivatives. But until then, Colorado is the only place that actively regulates it. Its CDPHE, its FDA equivalent, regulates industrial hemp derivatives as a food or a supplement. The interesting thing about that program, which we devised and lobbied for and were successful in adapting, and ultimately our clients led the way with their practices and their protocols, which gave our CDPHE comfort. Some of those great companies like Functional Remedies and Bluebird and Elixinol here in Colorado, some of the top companies in the country, CW Botanicals, to name a couple of others. But the point is, they just hired away the head of that program. The FDA did. After spending 6 weeks in Colorado studying that program, they hired the head of that program away. We know, because we're talking to the FDA, that they're examining these new pathways to allow these products to exist in the marketplace. We simply have not received that guidance to date. So that doesn't mean that people should stop selling CBD products, but the people that are selling CBD products should have voluntarily assumed the standards of the FDA and the good management practices to date anyway. So it should not change business for them. So unless and until the FDA comes out with a statement that prohibits the sale of CBD products, then it should be business as usual, although we are waiting that pathway and that clear, crystal clear guidance that will cause even more large-scale investment to come into the industrial hemp industry. I want to talk about just the cannabis industry as a whole. I always hear people say, we're having a conference, we're having a discussion about cannabis and hemp. Well, hemp is cannabis. Cannabis is the industry. Hemp and marijuana are the two sides of the industry. The plant, the genus is cannabis. There's no such thing as cannabis and hemp. There's marijuana and hemp. So please get your nomenclature correct, because it's embarrassing when I hear people talk about it. No one's done it on this call, but it's embarrassing when I hear people say cannabis and hemp, because that's just not what it is. It's the cannabis industry, which has two sides. I talked very generally about the Farm Bill, and what we do is we're going to see large-scale farmers come into play. And one of the trends that I believe you'll see in the industrial hemp industry is the use of certified seed. Certified seed by international governing and accrediting bodies like OECD in Europe and the AOSCA in the United States. That certified seed is important because farmers are not going to plant what I call CBD Christmas trees. In other words, marijuana plants that have high levels of CBD or other non-psychoactive cannabinoids. They're not going to plant it because there's no certainty that those plants won't test hot. Why would I invest in a CBD operation because the plants have 12 to 18% CBD, when if I wait 3 days longer, or if I get in a regular weather pattern, that CBD, that plant rather, is going to test hot above 0.3%, then you lose the entire crop. So large-scale farmers, frankly, the top 10 CBD companies in the United States and abroad, they produce all of their material from certified hemp seed that has 0.3 to 0.5 CBD, maybe 0.7 tops. My point is that's a trend that you're going to see. Why also will farmers plant certified seed? Because they get crop insurance with certified seed. You're not going to get crop insurance for what is akin to marijuana and runs the risk of testing hot. So that's a trend that I would pay close attention to. Another trend is, how do the retailers view CBD or hemp-derived products? They view it in a sense that it shouldn't be called CBD because it's not CBD unless it's made with an isolated CBD compound. And if it's made with an isolated CBD compound, you have more difficult problems under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act under federal law than you do otherwise, because you're perhaps traipsing on patents by these pharmaceutical companies or hundreds of other patents filed by non-pharmaceutical companies, and also infringing on drug approvals by companies such as GW Pharma, also known as Greenwich Biosciences, for their Epidiolex formulation. So your product should be a distillate or a broad spectrum product, and your product should not be called CBD. And the retailers who we represent are working with us to devise their plans where CBD is a notion, but this is a hemp extract that is perhaps rich or enriched with cannabinoids. Another trend that you'll see. Some of the challenges that you see in the industry, and looking at the slide in front of everyone, this is some of the pitfalls of investing in the cannabis industry. And about 50% of our business is marijuana related, and about 50% of it is industrial hemp related. Some of the challenges that you see, and I won't belabor the point because I want to get to the Q&A and really be able to deliver the most value for the participants in this conference. But some of the highlights on this thing is raising capital. It's very, very difficult to raise capital, or it has been, on your own. The marijuana industry is flush with cash in so many ways, and a lot of that cash, of course, comes from international sources, the Toronto Stock Exchange being one of those, and other Canadian efforts, and European and Israeli-based efforts. So there is capital available, but then that presents challenges about how do you bring that capital in? How do you structure an M&A deal or an investment deal when most states have very stringent disclosure requirements about their owners and who owns and who finances companies? These different regulatory requirements, state by state by state, on the marijuana side of the industry, they present difficult challenges, because if you come in and you want to invest, what are you buying? Are you buying an actual marijuana cultivation or distribution operation? Or because you're prohibited from actually being a disclosed owner because of residency issues, or perhaps you're a publicly traded company or otherwise, that prohibition oftentimes prevents you from owning the plant-touching elements of the business. So then your investment becomes an IP and real estate touching or marketing or employment company. And that's not what companies want to invest in. That's not what their investors want them to invest in when they're investing in the cannabis or the marijuana side of the industry. So these are some of the challenges that you see in a nutshell. If you could flip to the next slide, please. Try to bring this to a head so we have the most amount of time for questions. A lot of these companies now have standard operating procedures, best practices in place, inventory tracking systems, seed to sale compliance, but industry technology is really a driver in this space. industry technology, whether it is some of the systems that I mentioned before, or other systems that sort of supplement or help multi-state operators understand what each of their individual state operators are doing. That is a threshold requirement for large-scale investment. We're very proud to have been the lawyers on the first 9-figure deal in the cannabis industry, in the marijuana side of the cannabis industry. And when we completed that transaction, one of the things that the investors had come away with was they were pleased that the acquisitions that we helped them identify all had technology that ensured compliance with the local and state regulations, because that's a critical thing. You can't come in and conduct due diligence simply on financial elements or the leadership team and the structural design, but rather it has to be a far more detailed due diligence process, specifically for the marijuana businesses, that you really, really need to have experts go through. And I know the folks at CohnReznick, Michael in particular, these guys are very good at doing that. So please make sure as you're doing your due diligence that you don't stop at the financial due diligence. There is a political due diligence, a regulatory environment due diligence. There are industry-specific elements of due diligence that accounting firms, law firms in this space that specialize in this space do. Two other notes I'm going to make, and then we'll open it up to some questions here. Some of the times when you're looking at an investment in the marijuana industry in particular, you're going to identify extremely complex organizational designs. Why? Because you need to follow one principal tenet of structure in the marijuana industry, and that's sequestration. Sequester the assets, sequester the business operations. A, for 280E compliance. B, for liability purposes. C, because a lot of the times there are funding mandates from the funding entities as that money comes into the marijuana industry, where that money is going to go, real estate, for example, versus the actual operation, equipment and fixtures in the warehouse of the cultivation facility versus just to be spent without prescription in that industry. And some of those things are healthy to review, but I have to tell you, some of the largest law firms in the country set deals up in a simplified manner, and we do like simplified deals, but in the marijuana industry, it's not simple. You have to understand that complex designs are a fact of doing business with our complex tax laws and with our state-by-state regulatory structures. So to simplify things, even with the best lawyers in the country, we have to go in oftentimes and fix those from those law firms after those clients have spent $20,000 to $30,000 in structuring a deal. We have to go in and fix those because you can't oversimplify it, unfortunately, from an investment perspective. And then the last note I'll touch on before I turn it back to John is this notion of foreign investment. Foreign investors in the hemp side of the industry, very little impediment to date that we've seen with foreign dollars coming in or foreign entities investing in industrial hemp operations. This is agricultural industry after all. This is the industrial industry after all. This is not the cannabis industry. And if you're looking at industrial hemp as a cannabis-based investment, I'd suggest that that's a short-sighted perspective of what this plant can do and what your economic opportunities are. We're beginning to see the equalization of prices per acre among crops that have lower level of cannabinoids with multiple other distribution channels like fiber, like sugar, like cellulose, like lignans, like the building blocks for fuels and plastics. We're seeing those begin to compete with the dollars that come out of an acre of high CBD hemp Christmas trees. So please be aware that those dollars coming in on the hemp side, they could be under more scrutiny if it's a CBD-rich operation versus if it's a more industrial-based operation. But when you talk about the marijuana side of the industry, we've seen challenges for dollars coming in. States have broad discretion. They see money coming in from, for example, a Latin American country, and they're going to jump to conclusions and perhaps not allow that investor to participate in the investment, even if the laws allow for foreign investment. You see some challenges with immigration, green card status. EB-5 is a nice tool for bringing dollars into the country for investment into this space. And last but not least, we've seen a lot of activity at the borders. There are a number of Canadian clients and colleagues and close attorney friends that we work with that have very, very serious concerns about their ability to enter freely in and out of the United States because of family that might be here or otherwise, because Border Patrol have broad discretion as well to search your phone, to inquire where you're going, what you're doing, and to make a snap unilateral judgment on the spot as to whether or not you're allowed into this country ever again or at that particular point in time. And there's very little due process as a follow-up to that. So that is something to think about if you have immigration issues or if you are a foreign national doing business here. There are some things you can do to put measures and mitigate your exposure in that regard. So with that said, and again, in the interest of time, John, if you'd like to take it back and see if the audience has any questions.
I can jump in. Thank you so much, all of you, for presenting. It was absolutely fantastic presentation. Just before we get to any individual questions, there are a number of people that all had the same question, and I can answer that. Yes, we will make the deck available, and we've also been recording this, so we will also make the actual webinar itself available. So that takes care of about 15 questions, which means that you guys have been doing a fantastic job and people want to access all the information that you've been given. Also, I know that we're over the time limit, so a number of people probably have to drop off. We're going to try to keep going for a little while. The software that we use may also cut us off, just as a warning, if suddenly everything stops. That is why. I don't think it will happen, but I did want to just put that as a warning. John, do you want me to read you some questions, or do you want to go through the Q&A yourself? We could do it either way.
While you look at the questions, let me address one thing that Bob said, because we had this kind of friendly debate yesterday as we were preparing for the call about how complicated some of these structures get, and he's exactly right that because of the 280E issues, the sequestration of the investments, and the state-by-state structure, even the different municipal issues within any given state, the structures do get very complicated for very legitimate reasons. But I think of these structures similar to an estate or trust plan. It's something that needs to be revisited on a regular basis. And I mean, for example, if you look at California allows the 280E, allows you to deduct otherwise non-deductible 280E expenses on a corporate return, but not on a partnership or individual return. So that means that there are a lot of California operators that are defaulted to C corporations. If California law changes, there are a lot of operators that may want to revisit that. So I think that it's a healthy practice, particularly if you're planning for some kind of consolidation in the future, to revisit your structure on a regular basis and make sure that it has been updated for any regulatory changes that may have happened in your state over the past 6 months to a year, because we see things changing dramatically, quickly across various states.
Thank you for that. Here's a question. Can you expand on the problems for transferring money outside of the United States into other countries?
I can tell you anecdotally that we have talked to clients who have been told, who have operations in Canada and the United States, and have now been told by both their U.S. banks and their Canadian banks that they will no longer transfer funds across the border, and that Canadian banks will not hold U.S. denominated accounts. I don't know how common that is, or if that's a widespread change, but there are at least a handful of clients that have reported the same thing to us over the past 6 weeks.
Okay.
And this is Bob. I would just add that there are certain laws that require and bring additional scrutiny on dollars coming into the U.S. And there has been some challenges we've seen with transferring payments and dividends and profits, et cetera, to parent companies in other jurisdictions. One of the potential workarounds for that, if there's such a thing, is using a bank that operates internationally. If I had a Chase Bank, for example, that was here in Denver and it operated in Toronto, and I was transferring money to Poland, I can, with 2 clicks of a mouse, move that money from one account into the other and effectively move money internationally with very little repercussion. But those things have not received a great deal of scrutiny, but it's a present workaround.
Ooh, that's good to know. All right, I have a question for Harlow. What is the biggest mistake or oversight smaller operators make that hurts their ability to be acquired? Could be actually to anybody.
Yeah, so we see a lot of issues with sales and use tax. Income tax is definitely a big problem, but in a lot of cases, I mean, if you look at California, where you have excise taxes layered on top of sales taxes at the retail level, if you are not current with your sales and use tax, it's similar to in restaurants. You have a tight cash flow month, so you skip on your remitting your sales tax with all good intentions of getting caught up, and your second month, your cash flow is no better, and now your problem's compounded, and before you know it, you have hundreds of thousands of dollars of outstanding sales tax liability. It's going to be a big problem in due diligence, and it can also put your license at risk. So we don't hear a lot of talk about sales and use tax in the industry, and we think that it's a real pain point for clients.
Is that particularly acute in the retail side?
Yes, particularly. And if you think about it, the dispensary operations generally are your smaller operators. I mean, the larger investors are putting money into cultivation and processing facilities. That's where the build out is more expensive. That's where it's more complicated to get a license. So you see smaller operators going after dispensary licenses. They're undercapitalized. They're least able to afford a tax snafu, and they're also most likely to have a sales and use tax problem.
Good insight. Here's another question. In the U.S., and Bob, maybe this one's for you. In the U.S., what states do you view as being the best positioned to lead the U.S. hemp market, and why would that be?
I think you're going to see that the answer to that question ultimately split. Right now, production is king, right? Colorado, for the last several years, has been far, far and away the leader in hemp production. This year, however, it was surpassed by about 500 acres in terms of registered acres by the state of Montana. So Montana, Colorado, I believe Oregon's next, and then somewhere down the line is Kentucky. The point there is, once California, and this will be their first year of commercial production, once California comes online, California's Central Valley is far and away going to be the industrial hemp leader. The challenge there is California has not enacted any laws that allow the processing of industrial hemp for human consumption. So that keeps Colorado in the lead until they work that snafu out. But where I see that split coming is you'll see this become commoditized. And as it becomes commoditized, you're going to see certain states that buy the commodities are excellent at producing material and pumping products into the marketplace, manufacturing, if you will, and other states will be great farming states. And some will be a combination of the two. But that split is coming. It's just not here yet.
Okay. Here's one that actually has to do with marketing, but are there any considerations, legal or otherwise, for companies involved in marketing and communications for cannabis? This person is thinking about like ad agencies, public relations, brand strategy, that kind of thing. I know it might not be your exact expertise, but do you have insight?
Well, this is Bob. I can just say very generally speaking, if it's a hemp product, be very, very, very aware of the FTC standards about what claims and representations you can make about your product in the context of advertising and marketing. And on the marijuana side of the industry, I would be very cognizant of the local regulations. Cities, local jurisdictions, and states under the marijuana regulatory structures have very specific do's and do nots for advertising. And so it's not simply go out and hire an ad agency and let them do what they do best. There are confines and restrictions on that messaging and marketing.
Yeah, that's great insight. I've actually run into that problem here at New Frontier Data, even though we don't touch the plant. There are very strict things about what you can say, how you can say, what you can show visually. So make sure you do your due diligence and learn what the regulations are before you just go out and start advertising, or something like Google can block you, which of course you don't want to have happen.
And maybe I'll just add a quick perspective on the marketing communication side, particularly for companies that are B2C, that are targeting consumers.
Mm-hmm.
Cannabis consumer is evolving very, very quickly. And so the idea that the cannabis consumer of 2017 is going to be the same cannabis consumer of 2019, is going to be the same consumer of 2021, is just not true. The consumers are responding in a very agile way to the evolving product environment, to the evolving channels of distribution, to the evolving platforms that they can learn about and share information about cannabis. And so because the industry is evolving so quickly, it is necessary for marketers and communicators to be very proactive in kind of updating and refining their marketing and communication strategy to reflect this very quickly shifting environment.
Good point, John. Well, we're 20 minutes over, so I think this might be a good spot to call it. Thank you so much, everyone who spoke today. Thank you to everyone who joined us. Like I said, we will make the deck available. We will also make the recording available. And you can certainly reach out to any of us involved, and we will be happy to answer any questions that we weren't able to get to. Thank you so much, everybody.